Last couple of weeks at Camberwell, we've been looking at what we're calling a crossing over series. And without going too much into it, because we don't want to be here all day, Palm Sunday is the beginning of what we call Holy Week. And this idea that Jesus rides on a donkey on a road towards his place, right? Now, this is kind of a telling story, because at some point that road is the same road. But somewhere it goes from a donkey sort of encounter to a divine moment. It's a crossing over experience. Yesterday, if you listened to Dean's reflection, we talked about the table. Often Maundy Thursday, we talk about the table where Jesus had a meal with his disciples. And it went from a cup to a covenant. Same table, but it changed. And today we talk about the cross. The cross becomes for us a stepping stone, or a moment of which we go from there to there. I don't know about you, but there are times when I think, well, how am I going to get there? Now, I don't often think this stuff through all the way. And I can recall a story when I was a kid where I realised that my ambitions of crossing over from one thing to another thing didn't go well. Would you like to hear it? You're welcome. I used to live in Eltham. And we lived near a creek. And I was with a group of friends, and I thought, I reckon I could jump over that. But it was quite a drop, but it wasn't that far. So I thought, I'll take a bit of a run up. Yes. So I took a run up. I didn't get great purchase off the ground, right? And I got halfway, and then I was like, Jesus, save me. And as I ended up in about 3 feet of mud down the bottom, I realised that my experience or my endeavour to cross over from one side to another side wasn't going to happen. But I also know that in life there are times where we go from there. We have these little steps, these little markers along the way that help us to get from point A to point B. And now point A to point B isn't always just A to B. There's little steps, there's people, there's experience, there's encounters, and there's moments that we all endure or that we experience or that we get to share the great joy in that help us to move forward in life. In fact, crossing over, this idea of crossing over, any scientists in the room? No. Well, you're welcome. They talk about this exchange of DNA where say the two parents form a child. This exchange of DNA is called a crossing over moment, where something new is created, where something is birthed because of two things coming together. We're calling today Scoffers and Watchers, because when we look at the cross, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, that around the story of Jesus entering into the skull, Golgotha, into this moment, there were lots of people around enjoying some of this, by the way. Some of them were weeping, some of them were mourning, some of them were there just to check it out. Like when you go down the Monash and there's a car accident, everyone slows. I'm glad that wasn't me. Oh, bang, sorry. But this happens to us. So this term, this scoffing and watching, there are two distinct groups of people. Those that are watching, being careful, being cautious about the life that they live. And then there are those who are scoffers. He can save others, but he can't save himself. And in this room, I'm going to go out on a limb. We've got scoffers and we've got watchers. The idea of watching is not just having a good old look, but we are reminded to pay attention lest we fall into judgment or that we fail to respond to what God is calling us to do. The disciples are reminded to keep watch. Just be careful where you step. Don't be misled about what will happen at the end. In fact, earlier in Luke's Gospel in chapter 21, he says, watch out that you are not deceived. Be very careful that you don't fall into the traps. For many will come in my name claiming, I am he. And the time is near. And it says, do not follow. Watching is not passive. It's observing, being vigilant about the dangers around us. And our world is full of dangers. So we keep watch. The watchers were also standing around the cross. And the scoffers, who actively mock and reject. Scoffers stood around the cross of Jesus, and they were characterized by their hatred, by their blaming, recognizing that throughout Luke's gospel particularly, that there was no way. I cannot believe you have put your trust in something like that. Scoff, 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 scoff. That which is the weakness of God is stranger in human beings, the Bible tells us. So you're the Messiah, we read. Are you? Prove it by saving yourself, as you too, while you're at it, can you please save me? He submitted to all the weakness of the cross. He produced a most powerful miracle when he forced one of those scoffers who was hanging next to him on the cross. That's why we have 3 crosses. Got one today, but there was 3. Well, there was one there because he said, you can't do this. And he got him to follow. So a scoffer crossed over in that moment, recognizing that he could adore him. Recognizing that as he too stretched out his hands towards the cross or across the cross, that he was too to be saved. His life was being sacrificed by Jesus. We reach out our arms towards the cross, so Jesus reaches out his arms towards us. That's why the cross becomes central to us. Pharisees talked about money, the scoffers. Let's just call them scoffers. They like to talk about money. They like to ridicule Jesus. They taught about wealth and the kingdom. And Jesus dying on a crucifixion in this moment is of despair and anguish. And they said, here we go again. He can save others, but he can't save himself. You ever tried to save yourself? You can do it. Your own strength? No. Herod didn't like him. The soldiers didn't like him. They treated him with contempt. They mocked him. They laughed at him when he shared a story of raising the dead. The scoffers in Luke's gospel that we have read today, they create for us a posture. That a scoffer is a person who shows contempt for others, not just the cross, but for others. And this contempt is rejecting. It's a rejecting posture. Not a loving and accepting posture of God's work among us. We read a lot into the Easter story. We actually read a lot into the whole Bible, if I'm honest, but we're not going to get into that right now. As the crowds gathered around the cross, people were kind of, what's the commotion? And so there's this process that we have got in our minds of what happened, about the nails piercing the skin, the beatings, the humiliation. And the process for us is very, very clear. This happened, that happened. That's no good. But actually, if we flip that around, it's actually the people over the process. It's us at the foot of the cross experiencing this process too. Jesus, in his last breath, surrounded by people, in that humiliation, just surrounded by people just watching and waiting. There's a few people that gathered there. There's the them. You heard of the them? You know, when people say, they say, I say, who are they? You like imaginary friends? Well, the them, he is handed over to the them. Those who are responsible for his sentence. Pilate turned Jesus over to them to do as they wished. And as the group got louder and they're demanding and they're almost shouting, crucify him, their voices won. Their voices won. And so Pilate, we read in chapter 22, so Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they had demanded. As they had requested, he released Barabbas. the man in prison for insurrection and murder. But he turned Jesus over to them for them to do with him as they wished. Then there's Simon of Cyrene, just a bloke going about his day. Jesus is carrying his cross. The ultimate humiliation for someone who is about to be executed was their last act was to literally carry their own cross. The Bible tells us that this guy called Simon from Cyrene happens to be wandering, and Jesus is crumbling under the pressure of just carrying this cross. And they're like, can you? And he'd be like, me? Yeah, I'll grab an end. Yeah. And so he takes on this responsibility. It's called the patibulum. Anyone heard that word? Yeah, there you go. Welcome. Patibulum is the crossbar. That's what they carried. It was roped onto them so that they could hold this, leading to the site of the execution. But Simon was compelled to carry the cross. But you know what he did? He carried it. In that moment, going about his own business, he's seconded and he carries the cross. There's a large crowd that gathered, and a whole spread of society would have been there. And the emphasis on the large crowd, which I'm guessing means because there was a lot of people. Roman power was stabilised by carrying out executions. That's how you controlled people. That's why these executions were public, because when they're public, everyone goes, I don't really think I want to be on the end of one of them. You control people in this way. And this large crowd gathered. They couldn't shoot off emails or do posts or anything like that. They had to make sure that it was in person. And so they choose a public place at a very public time with a very large crowd for maximum effect. And whilst they are just called the large crowd, you could imagine that crowd would be made up of all sorts of people. Amongst them, watchers and scoffers. We also read that there's grief-stricken women. Not necessarily his followers, but people who had turned out for the execution. Just come and have a look. And the Bible tells us, and the history tells us, that part of the role for the women at the execution site was to sort of drug them, to sort of take the edge off, to calm them down. It's very hard to calm someone down, I would imagine, who's about to be executed. But this was the process that the women carried out on these days. They also say that these women gathered around this cross. Culture demanded that these women mourn more passionately. What does that mean? Wailing. Mourn more passionately. So we've got the them. We've got Simon hanging around. We've got the large crowd, we've got the grief-stricken women, and next to Jesus on the cross are two criminals. A man who was crucified with Jesus. And he says to Jesus, and I actually don't blame the guy. He says, you reckon you could get us down? Is it too late? And the other robber says, remember me. Remember me. When you come into your kingdom, remember me. There's a verse in this reading that's a bit odd. And it says, for the days are coming when they will say, fortunate indeed are the women who are childless, the wombs that have not borne or child, and the breasts that have never nursed. People will beg the mountains, fall on us, and plead to the hills, bury us. For if these things are done when the tree is green, what will happen when the tree is dry? If innocent Jesus, the green tree, can be killed, what does it mean for those that are dry? Jesus basically says it's going to be a bit bleak in the days to come. In Luke's Gospel, we also read with some interest that Pilate didn't necessarily think that Jesus was guilty. He says 3 times, I think he's innocent. Herod finds no basis for the charge. The criminal who's it calls for Jesus, he says, I think he's innocent too. The centurion and the soldiers, they agree at the moment of his death. Maybe he didn't do it. Maybe there's nothing to worry about here. Yet all these things, it's pretty harsh when you get 4 not guilties and you end up hanging off one of them. But the crowd persuaded them. The crowd persuaded them. We are part of the crowd. We are part of that crowd. If anyone, Jesus says, wants to be my follower, it doesn't say stand in the crowd or scoff and watch. It says take up my cross daily and follow me. There's a lot of imagery around the cross that is not really child-friendly. And it's this idea that runs through the narrative of the Old Testament and the New Testament of the blood of Jesus. In the Old Testament, animals were sacrificed for the sins of others. This sacrifice on the cross of Jesus was a sacrifice once and for all. It is done. It is done. Ransomed not with silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. Hebrews 9:22 says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So, this is where we end up. Lots of blood, lots of sacrifice, lots of innocent, lots of not guilties, lots of stuff. And yet, all of us sit as part of a large crowd at the foot of the cross. You know the good thing about crowds is no one can see you. What about stepping out of the crowd? You can keep watching, keep watch. You can scoff, it's all right. The invitation at Easter and every day is always to recognise that the sacrifice that Jesus made for us was a once and for all. An invitation to accept that the pouring of his blood wipes away all our fears. I read recently that there was, in the paper, there was an article about the great heists that have been pulled off. You know, who doesn't like reading about a good robbery in their spare time? And one of the things that they determined was that the best heists that have ever been pulled off are not like I would imagine, where people are sort of sneaking around in black lycra with sort of night vision goggles on and whatever. That's not how it works. What they wanted to do was to hide in plain sight. So some of the biggest heists that have ever been committed were committed wearing high vest. What are they called? High vis. What did I say? Doesn't matter. Sort of glow in the dark vests, right? So you think about a crowd like this. We can hide, or we can hide in plain sight, or we can just say, actually, this was for me. And every time I hear those nails go in, I am reminded that it was for me. I said before, the idea of crossing over is not so much about like just taking a huge leap from one side to the other. It's where the blood of Jesus and our lives is where they meet. And on this side of the cross, turmoil, crowds, chaos, uncertainty. The crossing over process for us means that we get to experience new life. Because when those two things come together, something new is formed. A shame is gone. Guilt is gone. Uncertainty is gone. Because he loves us. That's it. And so this cross, you'll drive past hundreds of these every day. But this one today could mean something different. Because without the pouring out of that blood into our lives, nothing changes. My invitation for you this morning is to cross over. To let your life meet this life in order that you would live a new life. The old has gone and the new is coming, and you can be a part of that new today. We're going to sing a song about the blood. My invitation to you, for some, you may like to come and just stand at the foot of the cross. You might like to come and kneel at the foot of the cross. You might like to come and someone can pray for you today. Let all these things collide so that we can live on the other side of that cross. Nothing but thy blood can save me.